how did you start out?
I really always enjoyed finance. I've always loved the whole Wall Street shtick, and coming from America, loved the stock market. Coming to New Zealand for university, it was a little bit different of a culture. I had some exposure to that, but it was vastly different than America. I've always kind of had a big understanding of the stock market and a big love for that. Before I did jiu-jitsu, I just sort of would walk into something and expect to be good at it straight away. You get in there and you realize that no one's really good at it straight away because it's not really natural. You just keep turning up, you listen to the instructor, and eventually you're going to learn things and get the hang of it. That then translated to other aspects of my life, like learning finance, learning how to build a business, things along those lines. So finance being a race where you're sort of running the race, each decision you make changes your position later. I think it really comes down to freedom. It might sound cliche. As you sort of build wealth, you take away from the need to be doing the things that you don't want to be doing. Wealth is the freedom of being able to use your time for the things that you actually want to do.
Right, we're going to kick into it. You
Sure.
brace yourself.
Sounds good.
All right, so what does wealth mean to you?
Good question. So I've had a bit of thought about this since Charlie invited me on a few days ago. I think it really comes down to freedom. It might sound cliche, but as you sort of build wealth, you take away from the need to be doing the things that you don't want to be doing, e.g. going out and laboring, making money for your boss, doing things outside of your scope of enjoyment. And so to me, wealth is the freedom of being able to use your time for the things that you actually want to do. But I also look at it as a holistic. So people think of wealth as just how much assets you've accumulated, how much money you have. I think of it more of a sense of achievement, where I sort of think of finance as a bit of a race. So think of each decision you make puts you in a different position later, sort of like how a F1 track would qualify for the race. So your position's determined by the previous races. So I feel like with wealth, each decision you make has a vast impact on your future position and what you're able to do. So I guess that's kind of a generic answer, but I think it really does come down to your freedom of time and being able to do the things that you actually enjoy doing rather than doing things for other people that they need you to do.
Yeah, okay. So has your idea of wealth changed over time at all?
Absolutely.
Yep. So what was it like when you first kind of discovered that you wanted to build your own wealth?
Yeah, so as I alluded to, it's not just about the assets and the money that you accumulate. I think there is a sense of the whole. So things like health, even if you're quite wealthy and you've accumulated billions of dollars, if you're not healthy, in my opinion, you're not actually wealthy.
Yeah.
Because that definition I just gave, the health is taking away from the time to spend on the things you want to do. So it's more than just that. It's the sense of having achievement, a sense of having a family that you love and loves you back, a sense of identifying with yourself and actually trusting yourself and understanding that you're doing the things that you've wanted to do and not sort of betraying yourself. So I think it's a lot more than just the physical assets and money that you can accumulate over time.
Yeah, okay. So there's obviously different ways to build wealth. How did you start out?
Yeah, so like anyone, I really always enjoyed finance. I've always loved like the whole Wall Street shtick, and coming from America, as he alluded to, loved the stock market, love all that sort of stuff.
Yep.
Obviously coming to New Zealand for university, it was a little bit different of a culture. My dad's from New Zealand, so I had some exposure to that, but it was vastly different than America, obviously. As he's alluded to, New Zealanders love property, but I've always kind of had a big understanding of the stock market and a big love for that. So for me, I've started out when I was sort of a teenager. My dad had me picking stocks. He basically said, go put a spreadsheet together, we'll track them over a few years, and then if you're as good as you say you are, then we can start to buy some stocks. So we did it pretend at first, but then we started to put some money into it, and seeing that wealth accumulate and the stocks gain and what does and doesn't work over time was a really good experiment for me as a teenager.
Yeah, it's really cool that your parents showed you that world and were happy to kind of walk you through it to start with, right? Like it wasn't a, throw you in your deep end, lose money, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So if you could go back and do anything differently, is there anything that you would do differently or in terms of starting out?
Yeah, I wasn't the best student, so I always sort of disregarded, kind of had a bit of a chip on my shoulder that I don't need to be out studying, I've got enough smarts, I know everything type of attitude.
Yeah.
If I could go back, I would have put a lot more effort and time into my studies, and I would have really pushed myself. So I did quite an easy commerce degree just because I was partying too much at uni, going snowboarding, this, that, next thing.
As you do,
Thought I had everything figured out. If I could go back, I probably would have pushed myself to do something more along the lines of like a double degree in law and finance. Really tried to push it as far as I can and get that education sooner because I realize now how important that is for your long-term goals and development.
Okay. And so if that was how you started your wealth journey, where are you at now? Like what are you currently focusing on if you're choosing to grow it?
Yep. So currently I'm a mortgage advisor and I also do KiwiSaver. I'm qualified to do investments. but I've worked in the bank, so I'm more focused on the lending side of things. I would say that's my expertise.
Yep.
And as I alluded to, and Charlie brought this up as well, Kiwis love property. So I feel like we are catching up in regards to things like stocks and other asset classes, particularly crypto. But in New Zealand, property does dominate. So I feel like that's where a lot of opportunity lies. So primarily at the moment, I'm building up my mortgage business.
Yep.
So I'm part of Advice Night, which is a group that I belong to, but I also have my own company that contracts to him.
Okay.
So how it sort of works is we give independent financial advice. We deal with all the banks and lenders. We don't generally charge fees to our clients, but we do usually get remunerated by the lender, which is actually a cost-saving measure on their part as well, because we're bringing them clients that work and sort of save them time on the assessment process. And then the other space that we're dealing with right now that's becoming absolutely massive is KiwiSaver.
Yeah.
I think New Zealand's finally catching up with the rest of the world in that regard.
Yeah.
We're still a ways behind. I think we're at about 100 billion now in terms of total KiwiSaver, which is tiny compared to the likes of UK, US, Australia.
Australia, yeah.
But it is good to see that there is some catch-up going on there. And I feel like a lot of the opportunity for the New Zealand financial sector is in the KiwiSaver space. So we're really trying to lean into that and get bigger in that KiwiSaver space to provide advice and manage clients over time.
It's a cultural thing as well, right? Because in the US and Australia, there is much more extra contribution to their investment accounts and more self-directed opportunities. So it gives the consumer more options. Yeah, so it's kind of a growing but tiny little asset base at the moment. But over the next 20, 30 years could grow significantly.
Exponentially.
Yeah. And it would be really interesting to see how that translates. Now, you mentioned obviously that crypto is getting kind of disproportionately popular here as well, whereas probably less popular than crypto at the moment from like the people I talk to on a day-to-day basis, which is great because it gets consumers and like market participants used to trading on an auction-based system that's liquid, but is very different from a stock because obviously a company is not just a stock, it's something that produces cash flow ideally. But it's interesting to see. I wonder where that comes from culturally, that because quite far apart, crypto to property. So it's kind of something that I think about quite a lot. Like what's the allure of crypto that's captured the imagination of kind of people in New Zealand versus
I would say social media. I think that's the difference. Like other asset classes don't have that same sexiness on social media with the influencers. So I feel like that generation are heavily influenced by what famous people and what sort of the tech bros are doing. And that's a lot more highlighted via like Instagram, TikTok, social media, LinkedIn even. So I feel like the younger generation have had an earlier exposure to that because social media is so prevalent.
Well, it's also unregulated, right? So when something's unregulated, it's actually easier to distribute online rather than information about securities that are more heavily regulated.
Absolutely.
So those crypto offerings are typically global as well. So there's not as much red tape, I guess. So that allows, for the, I guess, more open discussion about them perhaps rather than equities. And I think that with the New Zealand public market being quite stale, it seems, I think that probably has had a relatively large impact.
Yes.
And then when you look at some of the tax implications, I think that holds people back from holding more liquid assets, which I'm not a big fan of, because actually what it does is it forces people into more illiquid
property
assets that potentially less productive.
Yeah, it's good that you brought up the tax as well. I feel like, as we alluded to, the US, UK, Australia's superannuation is so much further ahead of New Zealand. And you look at, obviously there's higher incomes and there's reasons for that, but I also feel like the New Zealand government needs to come to the party and create like a tax efficient vehicle to boost the KiwiSaver investments. You look at something in the US like a Roth IRA, that's one of their versions of superannuation. I think the figure is $23,000 US per year, where you actually have tax advantage to put money into that fund. New Zealand with KiwiSaver, there's no tax advantage to do so. And so we're at 3+3, Australia's at I think 6+6, 12%, and they have a tax advantage to do so. So I think it's not just down to the person, but it's actually the government needs to come to the party and create that incentive for people to boost their KiwiSavers and have that tax efficiency versus other investments.
Yeah, for sure. And then that will basically get people in the habit of extra contributions perhaps, especially in a situation where less people are actually looking to buy property.
Absolutely.
And I definitely agree with the tax component, because at the end of the day, you want to encourage people to build equity in a diversified way that's actually liquid, because something that the regulators will be looking at next is liquidity.
Yes.
And the funds and the investments that you make need to be liquid. And I also think there's a social benefit to actually less capital capture as possible.
Yep.
Now, I think that it makes sense and is prudent to have KiwiSaver kind of held, I guess, in some degrees. I don't actually agree with it because I'm maybe a little bit too free market for this sort of thing. But I believe that, you know, outside of equities or property, the best way someone can build wealth is actually to build their own business.
Yes.
And I think that it would be really interesting to see the government come to some sort of, create maybe some sort of program where someone can go with a business plan and say, look, I have this business plan, it's well thought out, and actually that $50,000 in my KiwiSaver could generate me X amount of dollars in equity and cash flow for the rest of my life. And that's really where people are going to build like lots of equity.
Yep, completely
more
agree.
so than the stock market in most cases, because you're going to be able to get more than a 10% return on a small business that you can build up quite rapidly in the early days.
It's really interesting you say that. I'm not 100% the details on this, but I believe when the original KiwiSaver legislation came out, there was an intention for that it was first home or first business. But then obviously it just became too complicated around how that would actually look, and they just shifted it to first home. So it obviously had that massive impact on the property market, but I completely agree that the fastest way to financial freedom is owning your own. That's a Russ lyric, a rapper that I like to listen to. Own your own or you'll never be free.
Yeah.
So having your own business that you control, 9 times out of 10, if you know what you're doing, you will be able to outperform the market in both financial and as a holistic sense, because you'll be looking after yourself and your own interests.
You get that freedom. And we're actually kind of seeing a little bit of it from a employment perspective. Many people have multiple gigs now and multiple streams of income. So we're already seeing a path towards that just through kind of fractionalized employment. So I think it's definitely something that should be looked into.
Yep, definitely.
Cool. So you mentioned when you were giving us your definition of wealth that it's not just a finance thing, it's like a health side of it as well. So how have you focused on that side of building your wealth?
Yeah, so we had a brief discussion before the podcast about jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
Jiu-jitsu is very important to me. It's obviously a martial art, but it's actually so much more than that. So you're learning a new skill, you have your element of physical exercise, it's very good for mental health.
Yep.
You're meeting people, you're networking. So I feel like having something that you do during the day where you actually have time to set aside and go and do that is good for your health as a whole. You're going to get your exercise, you're going to be more calm, you're going to bring down your stress levels. And then when you do return to work and you do put your efforts into wealth building or going after compensation, you'll be in a better position to do that because you've sort of got all of the physical elements out of the way and you're much more sharp mentally and ready to go. And you'll also meet people on the journey that will help you in terms of networking.
Yeah.
So it's not always just about, I've never been a fan of, oh, let's go sit at a desk and work 12 hours a day. To me, that's not what the most efficient way to work looks like.
Yep.
You'd be better off going and, meeting up with a friend, having a coffee, having some networking, doing your exercise, taking care of your mental health, and then having, say, 5-6 hours of work where you're actually really efficient and happy to be there versus 12 hours where half the time you're not doing anything because you don't want to be doing it.
Yeah.
There's a book I read that was called Deep Work, and it was all about basically how you could spend a specific amount of time, and it's actually a muscle to be able to do deep, quote unquote, deep work. It's a muscle, so you can build it up over time. And especially in this day and age, I think we can do less deep work, but it's, turn off absolutely everything, have a timer and work for maybe just half an hour to begin with. And eventually you can build it up to even a couple of hours. And, I've got to that when I've been really disciplined where I can do 2 hours of really intense work. But like you mentioned, being able to split up the day and free your mind is really great. And then I listened the other day, I think we were talking about it, Helena, when Naval posted this thing of, he had this post where he was like, set yourself a time where you have these ideas, especially if you work a lot, that you have to throw them away. You can't write them down. You can't get distracted and be like, oh, this is a really interesting idea. Maybe for me, it might be a feature idea or an investment idea. If I have that idea during this 2-hour period, I have to go, no, I'm letting it go.
Yep.
Because again, it's the opposite side of the freeing nature of exercise, but it's actually also when you're then in the habit of always trying to work and trying to be productive. And it's actually about like sometimes letting go of quote unquote good ideas if you find that you're working almost too much or your mind is being dragged towards your work too much, which I found was kind of an interesting kind of two ends of the spectrum. One where you're intentional, but then one where you're actually like, no, I'm okay letting this go for now because this is not the time to be doing that. And it might be when you spend time with your kids or something like that.
It's hard to kind of like control the different facets of your life. You know, you've got your work, you've got your play, you've got your family, you've got rest time and that kind of thing. And trying to, I think being intentional about those times is so important. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to do. Like I know with 3 kids, trying to rest is near impossible, but I think having those time slots can make you much more productive in other areas of your life as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's a really good point on that freedom of time that I alluded to.
Yep.
Even if you're making, $1 million an hour, imagine a job where your brain is consumed by your role or by your business every second, 24 hours a day. To me, that's not really wealthy because you have no time to do things with your kids, things that you want to do in life.
Yeah.
So yes, you're making money, you're building assets potentially, depending on what you do with your actual money, but you're not actually wealthy as a whole because you have one element of your life that's consuming everything for you.
Yep, 100% agree. So then how have you brought your partner along on the wealth journey with you? Like, is it a conversation you had up front, or she's always been on board, or how did that work for you guys?
You mean like my wife?
Yeah.
So I think she's always sort of believed in me. I've always been a little bit of a finance nerd, so she's always known that I...
She knew what she was getting into.
Yeah, she knew what she was getting into. And I think she trusts me and she sort of lets me handle that side of things.
Okay.
But she's obviously come on the journey as well. I was a financial advisor the first time about 5 years ago with not much experience. And I was in sort of a commission-only role, and she saw me struggle with that.
Yep.
But she saw me not give up and just continue to hone my craft and get better and better. I did a brief stint in the bank after that, just with sort of the view of learning as much as I can, learning exactly how the bank do things, and just trying to network and figure that side of it out. And then when I went back to being an advisor the second time, I was much more equipped.
Yep.
So I think because she's seen me, I guess I would say that I failed the first time. She's seen me fail the first time, keep trying, keep honing my craft, go and seek the knowledge that I was missing, and then do it the second time. I think she trusts the process and sees that I do have a vision for the long term, and it's not just a get rich overnight quick scheme.
Win lotto. That's the $20 million question. All right, so if it's you and your partner. So, we had a conversation earlier when we were introducing ourselves to ourselves and talked about kids and the possibility of that. What are your thoughts about intergenerational wealth?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I've pondered that quite a bit. I've never been one for giving much of your wealth to the government in terms of taxes.
Yeah.
It used to sort of wind me up when you'd see like an inheritance tax being something like 50-60%.
Yeah.
But then when I've seen examples of it in other people's family and sort of the way people act in terms of like entitlement between generations, I actually almost agree with it in the sense of, I talked about the race theory earlier. So finance being a race where you're sort of running the race, each decision you make changes your position later. Imagine that you go run a race against a bunch of 12-year-old kids and you get your gold medal. You might have won the race, but do you actually feel accomplished compared to someone that's racing people their age and their level? So I feel like inheritance and intergenerational wealth kind of has that effect. Obviously you want to help the people that come after you, but you don't want to put them on a pedestal where they're winning a race against 12-year-olds, or they're being dropped 10 meters from the finish line and finishing first and then thinking that they're better than other people in terms of a race. So I think it's a balancing act. I definitely want to build intergenerational wealth, but I want to use it to equip the next generation, not to just give them pole position. Because I think there is a big difference between that.
Yeah, I think it's that educational piece around it, right?
Yeah.
Sorry.
And in a sense, you're robbing them with the opportunity of doing something great.
Exactly.
You're actually stopping them from having potentially adversity and going and doing something difficult. And I actually think that in a sense of wealth, if you look back on your life, it's probably the really difficult, not necessarily difficult, but the really intense moments where you persevered that, you'll look back on most fondly. So I totally agree with that. But I guess while you're here, you need to try and work out how do you, like you say, equip the people in your life. And it could be even just kids of the next generation that, you do come in contact with, whether it be, your children's friends and such, and they may not have a great upbringing, and I was quite lucky growing up that I had lots of people that didn't necessarily need to help me, but they helped me anyway. And that's kind of shaped my life in a way, and and it was little things. But those kind of small kindnesses go a long way, I think, especially as you look back on it when you're older and you're like, okay, maybe I can do the same.
Yeah, definitely.
Feed forward.
I like what he said about robbing them as well.
Yeah.
That example that I gave, let's say you're dropping someone 10 meters from the finish line of a race and then they win it. You've essentially just robbed them of the chance of winning it legitimately. Maybe they could have beat all the other runners if they'd started at the beginning, but you've robbed them of that chance because they never had that opportunity.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Quite interesting.
Yeah. How do you feel jiu-jitsu has helped you with perseverance? And have you got any examples of moments where you were tested on the mat, and then that then translated into, I guess, your everyday life, like, you know?
Yeah, I kind of see it as like a metaphor for life. So before I did jiu-jitsu, I just sort of would walk into something and expect to be good at it straight away.
Yep.
And if I wasn't good at it straight away, it's like, oh, this isn't for me. I'm not talented. I'm just not going to do it. But then with jiu-jitsu, you get in there and you realize that like no one's really good at it straight away because it's not really natural. So it's just one of those things where you just keep turning up, you listen to the instructor, and eventually you're going to learn things and get the hang of it. That then translated to other aspects of my life, like learning finance, learning how to build a business, learning things along those lines. So I saw it as a bit of a metaphor, and you can think of it like the belt system. So we use the judo belt system. We talked about this earlier.
Yep.
White, blue, purple, brown, black. As you sort of go through the ranks, as you look back, you realize how little you knew on the past ranking and how much you still have to go. So it's not just like an overnight journey. It's a day-to-day journey where you're going to capture knowledge. And the deeper you get, the more you realize you had less knowledge behind you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it was definitely appropriate when you talked about the fact that the belt system is actually an independent thing for yourself rather than the whole, it's not a leaderboard. I kind of see it as it's almost your own journey of self-discovery,
Yep.
which is, like you say, it crosses over into other domains. Like, I kind of find that, as a white belt, you're just completely, nothing, and you've got to just try and find small wins and small areas where you can improve and try and keep the scope quite tight.
Yep.
And then when you get to blue belt, you kind of know something.
You think you know everything?
But you think you know everything, especially at the start, perhaps when you first get your blue belt.
Yep.
And there's also this intensity about blue belts I've noticed,
Yep.
right? Where there's a lot of effort. And then as you get to the higher belts, the purple and the brown and the black, then there's an effortless kind of, yourself.
Yep.
I think by the time you get a legitimate purple belt, I think in a sense you know your game.
Yep.
You know yourself a little bit.
Yep.
And then I'm not sure about brown and black yet.
Yep.
Did you find a difference between purple belt and brown belt? Like,
I think, as you've just alluded to, efficiency, right? So you could have a purple belt that knows all the same moves as a black belt, but they're not going to be as efficient. And it's efficiency of movement, it's efficiency of effort, it's efficiency of like how you apply the techniques. So the game might look similar, but everything from breathing to how much movement's there to how much effort to game plan is just so much more efficient as you go up those last few ranks. And then the last thing would be the difference between brown and black that I'm finding now would be learning to teach. And you think you know jiu-jitsu, you think you know something, and then you go to teach it, and you realize that the actual art of teaching it is a completely different thing to actually knowing it.
Totally.
So I feel like that's the main difference, learning to be able to teach it in an effective way where you can teach a beginner, you can teach someone that's intermediate and someone that's advanced is its own skill, and that's the difference that I've found between sort of purple and black, and that can be applied to so many different things.
Yeah, totally, yeah. Like, yeah, I guess you can be it's like being an intermediate full stack developer and then being kind of a really good senior engineer is a big difference. But actually, if you kind of give them a programming task, they might get to the end of the task in a similar amount of time.
Yep.
It's just that perhaps the senior full stack kind of
Yep.
could take about 5 different approaches and
Yep.
would most likely pick the most efficient way to
Correct.
get there. Yeah, totally agree.
So you're on your wealth journey. Do you have an end goal in mind? Like, is there something that you're aiming for, or is it evolving over time? What does that look like?
I think it's evolving over time. Originally it was just, build a successful business and then figure out how I can exit, how I can sell it, how I can capitalize it to sort of provide for my future.
Yeah.
But now I think it's more about giving the right outcomes to clients. Like, that's what I really enjoy doing. Some clients you'll have an awesome outcome and not make much compensation. Some you'll have the complete opposite. So I think for me, as long as you do right by the clients and you have that feedback that you've helped someone achieve their financial goals, to me that's all that matters, because I know that everything else comes with that. All of the compensation, all of the building the business is derived by good client outcomes and good reviews and feedback from the clients. If you don't have that, you don't really have anything. And I think that's true with everything. If people don't enjoy the process, if people don't enjoy and value the advice and the service that you're giving,
Yeah.
what do you really have in terms of a business? How can you value it if you don't have that?
Okay. And so if someone was, they'd be like, okay, I want to build my wealth, what's some advice that you would give to them if they were starting out?
Yep. Slow down. It's not going to happen overnight. You don't have to have all the answers.
Yep.
Take every step day by day. Do one thing a day to improve your future. And I don't mean you don't have to go out and, invest every day, but you might research something, you might learn something new, in terms of what can and can't be done. You might go talk to someone that's done something that you are looking to do.
Yeah.
So I think it's a day-to-day journey where each day you move a little bit closer, but it's not a linear path. It's going to be up and down. But what I would say is just educate yourself as much as you can and get perspective from as many different people as you can. I think a lot of people will go to like one financial advisor or listen to one podcast and think that's the way that it has to be. I feel like particularly now, the world's really changed in the last 5 years. So using the strategies that have been applied, like in terms of just buying property, set and forget, I actually think that that's like an outdated strategy and you need to evolve. So you need to go and seek out as many perspectives as you can and then build your own plan and have an advisor help you build your own plan based on what you're looking to do, where you merge together all of the pros and cons and learnings and failures of the people that have come before you in different avenues.
What a good answer.
Yeah, that's good.
Awesome.
Is there any book or podcast that did change, the way you looked at the world specifically?
I do listen to a lot of Joe Rogan. That's quite cliche. On the finance side, I'd say I really like Warren Buffett. I really like Ray Dalio. So Ray Dalio's principles had a pretty big impact on me. I really like sort of his outlook on the world. Bill Ackman. There was a podcast recently that I listened to with Bill Ackman on Lex Fridman.
Yeah.
I would say if you're looking to invest or build wealth or anything to do with finance, that would be probably the best podcast that I recommend at the moment. Bill Ackman from Pershing Square Capital.
Yeah, isn't it interesting how some of the greats with investing, you think Druckenmiller, Buffett, Munger, Ackman, they're all extremely concentrated.
Yes.
But they just kind of ride the waves.
Yep.
But they know. I think the interesting about educate yourself. I think that and I feel like the risk potentially with crypto is that people are buying something they don't actually understand.
Absolutely.
And I actually believe that Stanley Druckenmiller said it, which was put all your eggs in one basket, but watch that basket really closely. And I do think that if you have a concentrated but diversified portfolio of 10 to 25 names, if you can hold through the difficult times, you'll most likely have much better outcomes than, an ETF, like a 500 company ETF.
Yeah, that was on that point. That was probably the most surprising thing that Bill Ackman said. He runs a big hedge fund. For those of you that don't know, he's probably, I'd say, top 5 most successful investors of all time. When he was my age, so I'm 30 now, he would have probably thought that he had to have exposure to 1,000 different things.
Yep.
Now that he's older and a bit more wise and obviously has more capital behind him, I think he holds positions in 8 companies, and that's it. So less is more. He goes a lot deeper in each of those 8 companies. He does his due diligence, and it's not just the financial metrics. His biggest thing that he talked about was the management that's running the company. Do they do the things that they say that they're going to do? So he'll actually go back and listen to shareholders' minutes from 5-10 years ago. They said they were going to grow revenue. They said they were going to cut this out. They said they were going to grow this much profit. Fast forward 5 years, did they do it? If they don't hold true to their word, I'm not interested in investing.
Wow.
And that's a much more powerful metric than any financial metric you'll look at, increase in stock price, anything like that. If the management can achieve what they want to do long term, that's a much better situation for an investor than any financial metric you could look at. So I find that to be very powerful, that less is more, but go deeper in terms of due diligence and looking into what you're buying, spend more time on each one rather than trying to just buy everything.
Yeah, I believe that's a good thing for life. It's often do less. Just make less decisions. Because you can actually have decision fatigue.
Oh, heck yeah.
And then I think that from Ackman and some of these guys as well as their, and it comes from one of my favorite books, Thinking in Bets, which is you can make a really good decision, like a well thought out decision where you had decent information, but it doesn't have the outcome that you desired. And if you look at a track record like Ackman's had some huge losses. But there's a few things he did. He lived to trade another day. So he never put himself in a position where, obviously over the last few days, you're seeing a lot of people get excited about GameStop again. It's more of a social element of like kind of screw you to institutions more than a money thing, it seems. So it's definitely a social movement. However, you're still seeing people put in their life savings into a meme stock, which is kind of putting you in a position where you're not going to necessarily, you never want to be out of the game. And I think these guys they talk about not trying to time the market, but it's time in market. But it's really about being in the game. You can also you can actually make educated decisions and try and manage your risk at different parts of the cycle. But what they really mean is don't stop playing. And don't put yourself in a position where it's zero.
Completely agree.
That's it. Is
That's
that it?
it.
Is that all our questions? Awesome.
Most of the questions.
Awesome. That was quick.
Yeah. been speaking for like, what, a good whack of time?
Yep.
Yeah, over half an hour. So
Yeah.
like typically we just kind of we're trying to get it to about 18 to 22 minutes. So we'll
Right.
see what comes out.
Yeah.
But yeah, it might end up at half an hour. We'll see. But really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me. That was awesome.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
really fun. And yeah, it was good that we started talking about Ackman and stuff. That's
Yeah,
interesting
my
to see
favorite.
that. I didn't think of that when we started the conversation. So much appreciated, and we'll have you on again.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Cheers.
Thank you so much.
It's all right.